I think we've reached critical mass. And again, thank you all for joining us today. Welcome. We're thrilled that you're here. And today, this is our Q1 webinar. We're kind of restructuring or taking a new approach to our outreach and speaker series events. You may recall last year we hosted 5 speaker series events. This year, we're going to have 2 in-person larger housing summits, both in the spring and the fall. More to come on that later. But in between those, we're going to host these webinars and really appreciate you joining today. Today, we are going to have Susan Henderson with PlaceMakers and Matt Lambert with DPZ, and a special appearance by our own Northwest Arkansan, John McCurdy, the Director of Community Development for the City of Rogers. You all may have crossed paths with Susan and Matt. So they've been very active recently in our region, working in both Rogers and now Bentonville. And I feel the region is very fortunate to have their attention. And again, appreciate them joining us today. John's going to add some local perspective and color by sharing a little more about the work that Susan and Matt have been focused on in Rogers in moving forward Rogers zoning and development code. Before I turn it over to Matt to get us started, there's a few new faces here today, and I just want to take the opportunity to share a little bit more about Groundwork. We are a newer work stream of the Northwest Arkansas Councils, and we are focused on catalyzing housing production throughout our region, particularly as it pertains to our workforce. As virtually everyone who lives here is aware, over the last few years, we've seen an exponential rise in housing costs fueled by rapid population increase, elevated construction cost, and ultimately the underproduction of homes. Nurses, teachers, firefighters, those that we rely on every day are finding it more and more difficult to find a place to call home that doesn't commit them to long commutes and a less than ideal lifestyle in Northwest Arkansas. Outward sprawl and pressure are also putting pressure on much of what makes Northwest Arkansas special to all of us, putting that at risk as our green and natural spaces are being encroached upon in ways that they never have, and our infrastructure is being pushed and demanded upon in ways it was never designed. One of the focus areas of Groundwork is on the systemic challenges within our municipal zoning and development codes. If Northwest Arkansas is going to get our housing issues resolved once and for all, we must have municipal support in adapting municipal codes to align with the new reality that many of the city's legacy zoning, and development codes are not equipped to address. Today's webinar, as I mentioned, is kind of the next iteration of our Future is Now speaker series. If you have questions, please drop it in the Q&A function or raise your hand, and we'll do our best to answer some of those questions at the end of the session. And we will follow up with a recording of today's webinar. I would encourage you to go check out our YouTube page. We have all of our previously done speaker series events and webinars posted there. There's some really good stuff there. And in that follow-up email, we will also share today's slides. So don't feel like you need to take pictures of your screen or feverishly write down everything that's going to be presented. I'm excited to turn it over to Matt, and we'll do so now. Thank you all so much.
Great, thanks, Duke. We'll do the fun share screen thing, and here we go. So we're talking transect zoning today, and that means we have to start with what the heck is this word, the transect? And we can often get away with using words that aren't the most clear, but we can get sort of beyond the academic basis and really tie it to the form of your towns and cities. We ran across this image randomly one time, and so this is a much more approachable way to really thinking about how we look at the transect and what it is, and how we tie it into zoning, which which is really looking at the form of towns and cities from small single-family homes and rural areas adjacent to those and into your main streets and downtown, and really dividing that in a continuum. So here's a series of images sort of splitting up the transect into our basic zoning categories. We'll talk more a little bit later in this in terms of how you have more or less diversity in the number of zones. But in general, we split the transect into 6 categories. The first is natural, and I think as Duke brought up just a moment ago, protecting your natural resources is critical for Northwest Arkansas. One core aspect of the transect is to identify the natural area and its role within the region as just as important as downtowns. So we start at T1 in the natural area, and then we move on to rural and working lands. So these are really also core to the importance of the region. You're losing a lot of this right now, and so just like natural lands, we also want to recognize rural lands and protections necessary there. Then we move on to suburban, which is a term we use. You can really use whatever it is that you want. Sometimes we say neighborhood or neighborhood preservation. And in general, these are your typically single family areas, some home occupations and so forth. Onto what we call a sort of general neighborhood. And this is the scale, a sort of mixed scale of neighborhood that has smaller single family homes, cottages, some townhomes, and often has had in the past small multifamily buildings and duplexes. In the future, it really provides an opportunity to have an increased housing intensity without actually feeling as though it's, you know, big buildings on garden apartments looming over smaller homes. So we're really talking about compatibility, but T4, this sort of general neighborhood, is what is missing in a lot of cities and towns, and so there's a big focus on that. Then we get into T5, and this is really your main street, your downtown area for most of your cities and towns. And then T6, which is the core. This is the really intense areas, which you don't have really much of right now in Northwest Arkansas, but there are a lot who are focusing on growing the region, and you're going to start to see some regional centers that have a lot more sort of intensity of business and housing and commerce mixed together, and that's what the T6 is. So you may not have that now, but it's coming. But to step back, the transect really comes from understanding the way that places were built historically. And John may say this, but what I found interesting the first times that I met him is that he recognized how the transect ties into the form of cities when he was a pilot, you know, flying over them, saying, well, this really makes a lot of sense because this is the way that cities are actually formed. So here's an image of historic Rogers, T5 marked on the main streets in downtown, T4, the smaller lot housing just adjacent, and T3 beyond in larger homes. And I also thought it was interesting that you could see the same pattern here in this 1888 drawing of Van Buren. T5 on the main street, you've got some smaller lot housing just adjacent, and then onto T3 and the rural areas and even the natural areas beyond. So it's really about understanding and coding in a way that is based on the way cities historically, towns and cities in America were built. And Northwest Arkansas was built specifically in this way as well. So we use that as a format to organize the city and organize the region and its place in the region. So this is another way that we draw it to say, in this case, the mix of what you have is really mostly natural areas and then a lot of agricultural lands. And as you funnel down, you don't have that many areas that are T6, but you do have some. Now, why do we use this? It's really because it does a lot of correlation for us in terms of regulation. So one of the hardest things is taking off your use hat, and instead we're talking about intensity. So T6, that urban core, is a really intense place, and things work specifically in that environment differently than that T4 area that was mixed that I was talking about, or T3, or even in T2 in the rural and working lands. Everything sort of changes on that continuum if we're thinking about regulation, and that could be future land use regulation when we're looking at land use categories and intensity and FAR. If we're looking at land development details, how large are blocks? Do you need an alley? What sort of park is appropriate? And so forth. The zoning, how are uses mixed? What are the size and height of buildings, setbacks, fences and walls, transportation, and other ordinances. So if you think about intensity and the different characteristics of the city, the transect allows us to align all these different ordinances and codes and policies with the part of the city that they are appropriate in. So we often refer to this, which is to say a brick wall wouldn't make sense in a rural environment, and neither would a split fencing make sense in your downtown. So one of the big things that it also impacts is transportation context. So the design of a rural street or rural road, actually, the design of a rural road would not be applicable in a downtown, neither would a downtown street be applicable here. In T3, streets have a different characteristic than they do in T4. The T4 streets may have slightly wider sidewalks, more frequent trees, and a narrower section. And then when we get to T5, the street purpose is really much different. You have much wider sidewalks and more lighting. Unfortunately, not great trees in this image, but the way that the tree meets the sidewalk differs as an important element. So we'll see that. One thing that I thought was particularly interesting is that the top image is the way the Florida State Department of Transportation is organizing all their standards around context-sensitive design, and it's borrowed from the transect. So they're identifying the fact that it's important to correlate the land use and transportation, as we all know, but the transect gives us a really good means of doing so because it's based on intensity and not use. So they're looking at, this is another Florida DOT image, they're looking at building setbacks, building height, the uses, where's the parking located? These are all things that we can regulate best using the transect as a framework and tie into the transportation system. They even provide this chart which shows the correlation between their context system and transect zones, specifically because it's built for that. And one example is here, the different user types. So how should you prioritize a street? Well, in T6, the pedestrian, this chart on the right, T6, the pedestrian is number one, as they are in T5 and T4, but in T2 and T1, they're not. So there's a different prioritization depending on mode, and that has to do with the sort of human intensity in any place. So when we code with the transect, in terms of streets and roads, it really correlates quite clearly with lane width and speed, with on-street parking. Where do you have it? How big is it? Where does angled parking make sense versus parallel? How planting strips should be designed. So the images on the right are showing 3 different types of tree planters. One being the continuous strip, which is appropriate in T3. T4, you typically have more people, so you may have benches and bike racks and so more areas of paving. In T5, you have trees and grates in a much more pedestrian-oriented environment. And that also ties into the design of the street itself. What sort of bike facility do you need? If you're in a sort of low intensity area, there's not a lot of traffic, so you can really mix in on the street. But if you're in a high intensity area, you really need to have dedicated or buffered lanes. So all of these transportation elements tie in really concisely with the transect, and they should change as you move from one place to another. So if you're in your downtown Main Street, that transitions to a neighborhood that's a little more intense and transitions to a neighborhood that is less intense. and the transportation context should change just along with the height of buildings, the setback of buildings, and so forth. So the transect pulls that all together. It also helps us focus on compatibility. There's really, it's clear from a land use perspective when we're looking at the allocation of zones that T6 and T3 should not be next to each other. But T5 next to T5 is great, and it really doesn't matter what the uses are. On one side, you have shops and offices, and you have housing on the other, but it's the building form that pulls them together and drives compatibility. And so that really makes it easy to look at adjacency, to require transitions, and to evaluate rezonings. So in this case, this is an example of how you would transition from T5 to T4 to T3 and adjacent areas. And that provides that sort of natural transition and buffer rather than big landscape buffers and wasting a lot of space by separating uses. Instead, this defines compatibility by the similarity of building scale and intensity of use. But where there is incompatibility, it does identify the need to transition, to provide step downs in building height, to provide additional setbacks. But rather than saying, well, how many thousands of uses are next to this many thousands of uses, and I can't really figure it out. This is really based on the scale of buildings. And so it's much easier to determine a large scale building versus a small scale building using the transect. So I did mention uses, and we always look to simplify uses when focused on transect zoning. This is a little blurry, but it's an actual example of a use table on the left from a use-based code, and on the right, how we pulled all those different uses together into transect zones. This is a large area, so there's a number of categories, but when you're focusing on use, you can really get into the nuances of how many salon chairs are there. Well, in this zone, you can have a salon with 3 chairs, and in this zone, 12, and in this zone, 20. But that's really an unnecessary distinction, and there's all sorts of those built into codes. So here's an example of a Main Street mixed-use area that we looked at existing zoning designations. So currently, this had 13 uses in 8 categories, but 13 uses for just 17 businesses. So each one of them had a different use in the code, even though the form was exactly the same. When you consolidate it, it's really 4 uses, and they're all in one category. So it's really thinking about the form of buildings, and that allows you to really simplify the use. So how does that actually work? Well, look at this building. I mean, we can recognize what it is, but the question is, what's the use? Does the form of the building matter, or the use more? Here's the same use in a different form. Same use in a different form. And hey, the same use in a different form. So coffee shops can be in all sorts of different types of buildings, and it's the type of building that they're in that matters more than the use. And so using that focus on the transect allows you to really consolidate that use table. So here's a sort of draft of uses in Rogers, almost all of them actually. And the correlation, if you sort of look at this from the left, there's very few uses, and to the right, there's a lot of uses. On the right-hand side are the T5s, T6s, and on the left, T4 and T3. So as you get more intense, there's more uses allowed. It's a really easy system to manage. And that's because it's focusing on form, not on the use on the left. Conventional zoning's looking at buffers and setbacks and different ways to separate buildings from each other because the form of the building could be anything, right? But on the right, when we're looking at a focus on form, it's about getting buildings to be similar, and then the use is really less important. And along with use, there's other controls that can get in the way of building the housing that you need or allowing the businesses to be built that you need. Floor area ratio is one that is pretty much everywhere, but these are all the same FAR. They're just different forms of buildings. So it's really not a good predictor of compatibility, and neither is density. So here's the same number of, or here's the same density, but with a different configuration. So 2 duplexes on the bottom left, that would be pretty compatible with single family. But the 4 big houses on the top left wouldn't. It's really the form that matters. And so I like to ask this question, which is, what density do you think each of these buildings is? That big building on the top left, the single family home on the bottom right. Well, the highest density is actually that bottom left looks like townhomes. It's 74 units to the acre. And that house is 14. When we focus on density as a number rather than the building form, really it means nothing. And so here's a duplex and a 4-unit building in my old neighborhood. The 4-unit at 32 units to the acre, the duplex at 17. So the number is not important. It's really the form of the building. And so that's why we focus on form and then on issues like permitting processes to make it easier for people to develop, and then on the use and the density, because the use and the density don't really matter as much as the form of the building and the ability for people to build quickly and easily to keep the cost down. So just one last little set of slides is, what does this look like in terms of coding? So here's our sort of base set of transect zones out of the model smart code, or an updated the model smart code that we can share. And this has T5, 4, 3, and 2, along with all the standards that we focus on: lot width and coverage, front setback, side setback, and so forth, for primary structures, accessory structures. But we also focus a lot on the placement of parking. The placement of parking is critical to the formation of streets and buildings. And that's really what we focus on, the form of the building and where parking is located. And here, whether that's residential or commercial on the right, isn't important as much as the sort of scale of the building. And so here were some drawings that we drew for Rogers, looking at different scales of T5, of a main street. You can have on the left a really low scale main street that may be appropriate in neighborhood. You can have a mid-size or something bigger. It's really calibrating the size of the building to the size of your city or town or different parts of the town that's important. So for instance, this lower scale T5 may make sense in small towns as their centers, but also in larger cities as their neighborhoods. And then mid-size towns have a slightly higher center, but in a big city that might be the corridor, and on the right for downtowns. In a similar way, we can calibrate the types of T4. So to what intensity is appropriate for your city or your town. You might have all of these, you might just have the low end T4. It really helps us still focus on that scale. And the same for T3. You may have more smaller scale, smaller lot single family, or maybe you're mostly this sort of medium or large. It's really that focus on form that's critical. Now, there are some things that you do often have to still provide some use zones for. Industrial is probably the biggest one of these: industrial, manufacturing, logistics. They just aren't compatible with the form zones directly. And then often highway commercial, the sort of big box and strip mall type needs a specific solution to evolving them over time. And there may be some areas that you want to leave like that, but focusing on the form lets us choose. So and as a result, with that form focus, we're able to additionally reduce zones. So our first pass in Rogers was going from 57 to 14 zones because we're not focusing so much on use, but on form. And then, it's not tied so much to this, but it's really important to simplify your processes to make it easy for development. And one way that the transect can help with that. It doesn't clearly help here, but looking at building form and the format of development helps because you're clarifying the expectations. So in this instance, we know that we have transition requirements that ensure that what comes next to existing housing is similar in form, and then we intensify adjacent. So it's really easy to understand where a rezoning makes sense, and if the new development is going to be compatible, so you don't have to go to so many hearings as a result. So that's what I have, and I'll pass it over to Susan to continue, and I look forward to questions in a bit.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So Matt has explained the context. I was asked to talk about the scalability, and in many ways, Matt's already addressed that. But so we've all done these diagrams, and this one we did for a town in Wisconsin, but it's where you look at that scale issue. And like Matt just told us, we can adjust this basically for anything from a village to a town to a city. And so thinking about Northwest Arkansas and the range of municipalities that you have there, you have a tremendous differential from village to city. And so, but however, the transect has a zoning framework, works for each one of those. And I just want to mention in passing, I'm on a team at the moment working for Ukraine. It's led by the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture in collaboration with a number of European universities. And we're building a model zoning code for the enabling code for the country, working with the federal government. And then we're working on the scalability, and it's from the largest cities of Lviv and Kyiv through towns, villages, and even into hamlets, and then adjusted both regionally and topographically. And so the really cool thing is that the transect works at virtually any scale. It can give you the really high level regulations that are based on place type. And then within each place type, the transect zones can shift, like Matt was just discussing. So here's a photo I took in a village called Alesko. And from the castle, looking out onto the landscape, you could see in the foreground the T1 natural of the lands that surrounded the castle, and in the distant mountains. Then in between, you see the T2, the farming fields. You see the T3 single family on the far left, segueing into the more diverse T4. And then in the center of the village, there you see at the church and the city hall, there is a little bit of T5. And so in one camera shot, I didn't have to be in John's airplane. I could see it with a single lens, almost the entire range of the transect within this village. So looking at how that actually plays out, speaking of PlaceMakers now, we have worked in communities with these scales. We used to do these diagrams all the time, and Matt, we really need to up our game on this again, where every time we did a zoning code, we would do one of these vertical transects for the cover of the code. And so from El Paso, which is the largest community that I've worked in personally, it's a metro region MSA of a million, and the city itself is 678,000. But you see, from the mountains to the downtown, they have the entire range of the transect within their municipal limits, which is kind of shocking because in many big cities, you actually lose T2, and sometimes you lose T1 as well. Hutto, Texas is a little smaller than Rogers, but it's in the Austin, Texas MSA, and it has everything from T5 to T1. Fitchburg, Wisconsin is adjacent to Madison, and once again, everything from T5 to T1. Taos, New Mexico, back in the high desert of northern New Mexico, is a 1500s Spanish colonial town. And it's really fascinating because this was one of the hardest coding projects I ever had, because the frontages are not what you expect in an Anglo colonization pattern we have a much different development typology than the Spanish prototypes. And so looking at the range of frontages in Taos was a real challenge, but we found that the transect worked there as well. We just had to make the adjustments. And finally, the smallest community I think I've worked in is in the Washington metro region of Ranson, West Virginia, with just a little under 6,000 people. But in every situation and at every scale, the transect provides an appropriate framework for the zoning. And I just want to say it's tailor-made. It's not one size fits all, because in many situations we use the model smart code. People think of it as a one size fits all. It's not. And you see the little slideshow on the right that was done for El Paso. I built this app a few years ago on my iPad, so we could do we call these synoptic surveys, but we go through and we actually look at the physical context of the place and what are all the components of it, so that then we can adjust all the things that Matt already talked about, the transect zones, the block sizes, the parks, the streets, the frontages, and even historic district regulations where they're appropriate. All of those work within this larger transect framework, but they can be very, very finely crafted to the local context. And we were also asked to talk about the benefits of transect-based coding. I just want to be clear at this point, this applies to all form-based coding, because form-based codes create a type of place that's different than the conventional coding that most of y'all in Northwest Arkansas have on your books today. And there are paybacks to people, planet, and profit. The first we'll talk about is the economic paybacks. I know y'all are very familiar with this. Bentonville and Rogers have both been working on it, but walkable neighborhoods, which are a product of form-based codes, build resilient economies. There are a couple of really important studies that were done in 2010 and 2013 by the EPA and Smart Growth America, looking at budgets and cost impacts. And compact development cost 32 to 47% less for infrastructure than conventional development patterns. That was from the Morris Beacon study for US EPA. And an average of 38% up to 50% less costs in building and maintaining road, sewers, and water lines. So the savings on compact infrastructure is significant to the municipal bottom line. And then on top of that, you look at city services and the things that are provided. And this study was done just with police, ambulance, and fire, but it also applies to schools, libraries, all parks and open space, all of the benefits that a city provides to its residents. These on average are 10% less in ongoing delivery of services. And finally, y'all know a lot about this because Urban 3 has been in the region, has done some work for both Bentonville and Rogers. And on average, there's 10 times more tax revenue per acre. And that's in many communities, that's dealing mostly with sales tax. I will mention that in the same study, one of the case studies was Nashville, Tennessee, where a colleague of ours, Rick Bernhardt, did a series of form-based codes per neighborhood over his tenure there, and they saw over 1,000 times income per acre increase in sales tax revenue, which that's just mind-boggling. But they also saw exponential growth as a result of those codes. And over the same time frame from 05 to 13, during the housing crisis and the Great Recession, Davidson County is a rapidly growing MSA, and it was still, property values were increasing 33% even in the depths of the recession. But the neighborhoods that had form-based codes they increased 115%. That was 3.5 times greater than the region as a whole. So the economic impacts of form-based codes is really quite significant. And then the environmental impacts also are incredibly significant. Sorry for me throwing in an image from my corner of the world, but this is my afternoon hike on Sunday. But looking at the Rogers and Bentonville, the Center for Neighborhood Technology, I just looked these up this morning, so they're quite current. The total housing plus transportation costs are significant. Now, y'all talk a lot about housing costs, and we know that they've changed dramatically in the region, but the average annual transportation cost per household in Rogers is 25% of annual income. And it's combined with the 24% average for housing, giving a total for Rogers of H plus T of 49%. And what's really interesting to me is that the cost of transportation is even 1 point greater than the cost of housing with that data. And it's as exorbitant as it is to live in Northwest Arkansas, it's also exorbitant to manage transportation costs because so much of the region is auto dependent. And then looking at what that does in environmental impacts, the greenhouse gas per household, the average is 8.63 tons. And the average annual household VMT, our vehicles mile traveled, is 20,375 miles. So you see the dark red, red's bad, yellow's good. There's no yellow on this map, and green is even better. So it is a very auto-dependent region. And fortunately, all of the zoning work that's being done at the moment regionally can begin to offset that by being able to localize services and goods to neighborhoods, achieving tremendous trip reduction, as Matt referred to earlier. And so then we were also asked to provide a case study. And this isn't the Rogers case study, which John will get into, but it's one that I was quite involved with in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And in the 20s, this was their downtown. It was their main street. And it was a vibrant, busy, successful little town in southern New Mexico. And as a result of a 1960s incredibly unfortunate urban renewal event, over 600 downtown structures were demolished. And this became this. This was when we first began working there. They had closed their main street. They had converted it to a pedestrian mall. The superstructure had been taken down by the time we came on site. But as you can see, virtually every building is empty. And this wasn't caused by zoning, but the zoning that they layered on top of it was use-based, and it did not reflect the neighborhood character. It didn't enable or incentivize redevelopment, and it basically locked the whole downtown in that failed state of urban renewal. So when we began working on their downtown master plan and zoning code, I want to call your attention to this 6-lane drive-through, bank drive-through. That was the heart of Main Street, and we'll look more at that in a moment. But you can see this horrible oval loop that was created from urban renewal. Prior to that, it had been a connected grid. And then they created this one-way loop that the locals call the racetrack, because the teenagers like to see how fast they can corner on the outside loops of the racetrack. And so one of the primary things was reconnecting the grid. And like Matt talked about, there are streets that are appropriate in your neighborhoods, and there are different streets that are appropriate in your downtowns. And what they had were streets that were appropriate in a highway condition. And so a big part of the effort was, in fact, zoning reform and street reform. But once again, looking at this parking lot, at this drive-through, part of the effort that was made was to convert that to a plaza. Of all of the Spanish development cities in New Mexico, Las Cruces was the only one that had lost its plaza as a result of urban renewal, and there was no heart in the city. There was no place for people to gather. There was no sense of community. So in this case study, we talked about economic benefits, we talked about environmental benefits. And now in this case study, I want to mention the social benefits of building under a form-based code. So there was a local developer that partnered with the city. It was a P3, and we designed a plaza, and then we zoned it with transect zones. The dark part you see in the middle is the historic district zone that had height limitations, then T5, and then it feathers to T4 as it segues into the neighborhood. And I just want to show you a brief video explaining what it was and what it became.
Susan, we can't hear the music.
I'm sorry.
Just letting you know. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me go back to this. I had that on, and I failed to turn it back on. So the benefit, really the social impact of that, in my opinion, it's been priceless. And it wouldn't have been possible without being enabled by a transect-based form-based code. And with that, I will pass it to John.
Thanks, Susan. And by the way, I did make a note that we're going to want one of those drawings on the front of our development code when we're done with this. Well, I had a lot of I had kind of a rough outline in my head about what I would talk about, and then after listening to Matt and Susan, of course, I've been scribbling notes, and my whole plan has gone out the door. But I do have a few things I wanted to say and share with the group. First of all, I heard a quote yesterday that kind of stuck with me, and it was basically, I'll paraphrase, if you think you can influence people with data, you're not paying attention to the data. And so You know, there has been a lot of work done on how effective a form-based code can be, how much sense it makes financially. And to me, one of the things that initially attracted me to the idea of thinking about future land use management and zoning management from a form-based transect perspective was that in the literature, and mostly in the popular literature, it's one of these ideas, one of these concepts that appeals to both ends of the political spectrum. And there aren't that many things that bring people together today. It's not universally true. There are certainly people on both ends of the political spectrum that will criticize this approach to planning and vice versa. But it's interesting that there are very conservative groups that are promoting smart growth. There are very liberal groups that are promoting smart growth because it just makes a whole lot of sense for a lot of different reasons. I think that one of the key factors in why this is so attractive is that it's just the natural pattern of development. If you look at the scope of human history, I would say all the way back to the development of small prehistoric villages. They were built around this type of an approach where you have a center that's more intense than the edge. You get into the development of where you've got a walled castle, castles spread throughout the landscape. Within those walls are fairly intense land use. Now you do you go from a T3, T4 right down to a T2 or T5, T6 right down to T2 at the outside of that wall. But you'd have a castle that was a very intensive land use area surrounded by farmland, and when things got rough, everybody would get behind the walls. And then it's fascinating to look at the city of Pompeii and some of the archaeology because it's so deeply preserved and exquisitely preserved. The city of Pompeii looks like a modern city. It's got gutters. It's got street names with a numbering system that's familiar to us, sidewalks, everything. And we have unearthed these structures where people would literally have a fast food restaurant off the sidewalk and an office space behind the counter, and then upstairs or behind that you've got a family area. And the likelihood is that one of the parents worked outside of that structure. The rest of the family lived in the structure. And so there's this mix of uses within the city, and then this transition from the center of the city outward, a very efficient use of land. At some point during the Industrial Revolution, we realized that it's probably a bad idea for there to be noxious factories in the center of the village, and people are starting to have health issues, and it negatively impacted quality of life. And so society made the good decision to separate certain uses from other uses to make sure that you don't have noxious uses where people live and it's going to impact people negatively. And as Matt mentioned, as the city of Rogers and other cities today are looking at kind of transitioning from a use-based approach to zoning to a form-based approach to zoning, there's still a need for that. We are preserving industrial parts of Rogers. We're allowing more mixture of uses in those industrial areas because we really don't have those types of noxious industrial uses today that we used to have in the 1920s, 1930s, late 19th century. But that was a valid concern with a significant public interest in keeping people healthy. Over time, this idea that we manage uses, I think, got out of hand, and it had a lot of negative consequences. I think there were some ulterior motives in segmenting uses. You look at redlining and how use-based codes were used to create ethnic neighborhoods and to discriminate against people and separate people and things like that. And so today in most cities in America, it's just taken for granted that the role of city government with respect to planning is to segment uses. But that's not a traditional natural way for things to happen. The traditional natural way for things to happen is the way that the city of Rogers and the other cities in Northwest Arkansas developed in originally, typically over some kind of a transportation intersection like a railroad stop or something like that. A city emerges. Within that core of the city, you have uses, you have structures that are a whole lot more like Pompeii, where typically you'd have a 3-story building with a shop on the first floor, office space on the second floor, maybe renting some of that out, maybe, and then the people that work there, the family would live on the third floor, or some combination like that. And so that's just kind of how things develop. It's very efficient. It leads to a high quality of living. And we made that illegal in the 40s and 50s. As we became more and more obsessed with segmenting uses, whether it made sense, whether it was justified or not. And so in a large sense, this is a return to a more traditional values about how cities are allowed to develop. It can be much more laissez-faire. I'm not telling you what you can do in your property, but we are managing how your property can either negatively impact the community at large or not. And so because of that and other reasons, related to environmental equity and social equality, this also, so it appeals to people on the right who are concerned about fiscal responsibility, but it also appeals to people on the left who are concerned about some of the negative ways that use-based codes have developed over time to discriminate against people. So in Rogers, we kind of started with what are our values and what are we trying to accomplish with this? And this, I think this is where you kind of jump beyond data and appeal to people's sense of right and wrong and where their hearts are. But we kind of settled in on 2 areas. One is the need for fiscal responsibility and long-term sustainability in terms of how can we manage growth in the city of Rogers in such a way that the city of Rogers can continue to pay for itself and can maintain these things that we're doing. Most of you are probably aware on this call that in Arkansas, and this is somewhat unusual, in Arkansas, cities rely almost exclusively on sales tax revenue for the city's coffers. And so that leads cities in Arkansas to be very concerned about sales tax. As Northwest Arkansas grows, I think some of the outlying cities are under tremendous pressure to approve subdivisions. And the way subdivisions work is a developer comes in and builds a subdivision. The city requires public infrastructure to be built to support the subdivision, i.e. streets. And then the developer dedicates those streets over to the city, and it's wonderful. Now your small city is growing fast. You're getting many more people within your city. And you're also taking on these liabilities of public infrastructure that are going to have to be maintained over time. And a street has about a 40 to 45 year shelf life before it's going to have to be significantly maintained. And so we're kicking the can down the road about 40 or 50 years before the real cost of growth in these smaller towns comes due. It's a big issue in Rogers. Probably about 2/3 or more of our total area has been annexed since 1980. And so we're coming up on about 45 years of most of our streets starting to be built. And if you drive around town through subdivisions, you can see that the minor roads in Rogers that have never been, we've never had to mill and overlay these, we've never had to do much to them, are getting to the point where we're going to have to start getting very serious about maintaining our infrastructure. One of the attractive things about a form-based code and transect theory around land use is that it creates these more compact areas that are more efficient, that the sales tax generation per acre is much higher than it is for auto-centric development like a large supercenter or any other kind of very large parking lot. And so it just fiscally, it makes a whole lot of sense. In terms of the other thing in addition to fiscal responsibility that we're really trying to focus on is just quality of life. And what does that look like? Well, some of it is that you don't have to live 50 miles away from where you work. And I've experienced this having worked in a lot of different places around the country. I had about an hour-long commute to work every day in Northern California. That's 2 hours away from my family. It's 2 hours away from the gym. It's 2 hours away from, quality time with the people I love, where I'm sitting in a car. That's a huge detractor for quality of life. It's also a huge expense. If you have to move an hour away from work to find a place you can afford to live in, then you have to factor in the cost of transportation as part of the overall cost of housing. And this is something I think Duke's done a great job of communicating to the area, that our solution has to be creating housing that is co-located with the places where people are spending their time, whether that's leisure time or work time, professional time. But the less we have to be driving around just to live our lives, that's a tremendous impact on quality of life. Another point that I want to make before I kind of talk about Rogers is, Wes Craiglow with ULI has been throwing this number out recently, and I think it's super important to us that between Benton County and Washington County, our agricultural economy is about $1.5 billion. That's not nothing. And I don't think of, until he started communicating this, I didn't think of Washington and Benton counties as still having that significant of an agricultural footprint, but that's huge. We don't need to lose that. We also don't need to lose the things that make this area so beautiful. I'm fifth generation Benton County. I'm from this area. I'm native, but I've lived most of my life away from here. And I was literally living abroad trying to figure out where I wanted to kind of make my final move and settle down. And I looked back to Rogers and the beautiful Lake Atlanta Park project and some of the great things that are happening here with the AMP and in Bentonville and Fayetteville and Springdale. And it's just a great area. I mean, in the whole world, it's a fantastic place to be. So much of that is related to the beauty of the Ozarks and the beauty of our streams and lakes and open space and the farmland. I still think it's pretty charming to fly into X and A and get out of the airport, and you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. I mean, if people remark about this, people coming in from New York or wherever, they think they've landed in just the middle of nowhere, and the next thing you know, you're bougie downtown Bentonville or bougie uptown Rogers or Dixon Street, and you realize, wow, place kind of has it all. If I could do one thing, and I can't do this because I'm just City of Rogers, but one thing I talk about and I try to influence, if we could just do one thing, it would be the preservation of that T1, T2 county land surrounding our municipal areas. If the cities could all agree that we're not going to expand beyond what we need to do, I mean, each city has its own needs, but expanding laterally and recognizing that lateral expansion carries a very expensive long-term sustainment tail. But to think more in terms of compact development, mixed-use development, managing the transect and providing holistic development that pays for itself versus long cul-de-sacs where basically the further you go down that cul-de-sac, it turns into a private road that's being maintained by the city, and our tax dollars. The more we can keep taxes low, the more we can preserve the natural beauty of our area, the more we can sustain livability and have something that just works. And Matt and Susan are more have a greater perspective on this than I do, but there may be no other place in the country with as much potential to really nail this as Northwest Arkansas. We've got this rare combination of significant growth. One of the fastest growing sub-million MPOs anywhere. There's a ton of money here. There's a lot of wealth. There's beauty, everything that we need. And we've screwed some things up, but we haven't gone too far. We can do some sprawl repair. We can do some things with coding and incentives to repair some of the things that are not great. It's not too late. And we're at such an inflection point. If we get this right, this will become one of the greatest metropolitan type areas in the country. I mean, we're not going to be New York, but I mean, a true, urbanized area. If we get it wrong, it's going to be urban. It's just going to be more like Oklahoma City, LA, it's just going to be choked with cars and not very livable, and we'll lose some of the things that we love the most about it. So that's my attempt to go beyond the data. Let me share my screen if I can do this.
While you pull that up, Don, I'll give you one data point that we just
Okay.
learned in Bentonville, which analyzing housing growth, different types of housing and so forth. We found that that townhouses and above, even given your property tax structure, that you could pay for yourself if you're at a townhouse or higher in intensity. It's about that 20 units to the acre. So it's really helpful in adding. I mean, there's the data that doesn't connect you, but it's basically to say that you can do well with housing. You just can't do well with the housing that's typically being built.
Okay. Is this working? It doesn't look to me like it is, but is it?
Yeah, we can see it, John. I
Okay.
think you just need to
So
hit the
It's not-
presentation.
Yeah, it's not in play
Presentation.
mode.
There you go.
How about that?
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. All right, so this is just 3 slides. I wanted to talk to a little bit about what this looks like in practice. So this is the growth comprehensive map. One of the mysteries of life is why we called it the growth comprehensive map instead of the comprehensive growth map. But this is basically the land use approach in Rogers until about 2018. And essentially what you see here is these red areas on the map are existing major roads. So essentially the approach to land use planning was everywhere where we have a lot of traffic, we're going to allow into, commercial uses. And so every street that has cars on it, our plan is to line that street with cash registers. And, the problem with that is that every time you build a street and it gets a bunch of cars on it, you put a bunch of left turn conflicts and auto-centric development on that street. Well, the street stops functioning. And so it becomes more and more gridlocked. And then you widen the street. As you widen the street, it negatively impacts the businesses that you allowed to be on the street. It makes it impossible to walk on. It makes it even more difficult to deal with the traffic and get people turned left through intersections. And it just kind of creates this downward spiral. And I'm not going to point any fingers because Rogers has done this, but I think there are other cities in Northwest Arkansas who have deeper problems than Rogers in terms of saying yes to every strip mall on every major road. You also, in a typical American city, which is built around the kind of Jeffersonian grid of section lines, you ensure that every neighborhood's going to be in a square surrounded by strip malls. And it's just not too great. Transportation's bad, and you grow your way out of laterally. So in 2018-ish, I think 2018 is when we first passed this. This is our comprehensive growth map that we adopted. This is the current version, more or less. And on this growth map, what we did was we identified every major intersection pretty much in town. And it turns out that these are about a half a mile apart because, again, a section is a mile by a mile. And we tended to do, as most cities have, an arterial or a collector at half mile spacing. So you start with the county roads, and then you kind of fill those in with another road about midway through. So about every half mile, these blue areas are major intersections where we allow mixed use development. So a mixture of retail spaces, higher intensity residential uses, apartments, townhomes, things like that. Back to some of the earlier slides, this would be what, Matt, like T3.3, T4.1. type development, a little bit more intensive, but still, you know, fairly residential. If you've been to most towns anywhere in the world that are old towns, you'll see these, you know, these neighborhood centers. Might be the neighborhood bar, it might be a church. And so we disperse these through town and then allow by right mixed use development at a higher intensity level than we would in the other areas. The pale blue everywhere is neighborhood. And so this is really set aside to be, for the most part, single family housing, but then also with a certain level of coordination, we can approve multifamily development where at this point in our evolution, when we adopted this, we were still attempting to kind of push the higher density development near corridors and these neighborhood centers. The orange areas or reddish orange areas are what we designated to be regional centers. And these are areas that either are or aspire to be intensive to the point where someone might drive from another town to go there. That was kind of the acid test. Is it conceivable that somebody in Springdale, Bentonville, or Fayetteville might drive to downtown Rogers? Yes. And so we really wanted to focus a lot of intensity there. Also, it's the traditional, you know, downtown area. And then over on the left side of the screen, you'll see the I-49 corridor, with the Pinnacle Uptown Rogers area being the large red area. And then down by the Pleasant Grove interchange is that more southern one. The yellow and sort of orange-ish colored corridor areas, the yellow is mostly industrial, and then the orange-ish is more highway, what we would consider now highway commercial. I do want to point out the green areas on this are two streams that begin basically in downtown Rogers and then converge at about Village on the Creeks and then exit the city, you know, over in the southwest and into the Illinois River. I think in an ideal world, you start with topography. If you go to Eastern Rogers, you're into, you know, hills and hollers, and then further out on the left, you're getting into the plains. But you start with what does the terrain look like? Where are the streams? You don't want to build in the floodplain, things like that. Since we're late to this, we already have some centers that are in the floodplain, and now we're really looking at ways to kind of mitigate that. But I think you start with the natural environment and where do you want to preserve green spaces and green corridors. Otherwise, back to fiscal responsibility, if that floodplain develops, it costs us all a lot of money over the long haul because it will have negative consequences. And so this is where government's role as kind of the referee comes to play, where, yes, I understand you own that property and you have big plans for it, but by developing it, you're going to create a public liability that's excessive. And so as a city, we need to manage those things. And this gets into a political philosophy that you may or may not agree with, but that's the way that we're approaching this, is that by acting responsibly and regulating responsibly, we're ensuring that future taxes are as low as they can be and that the economy continues to thrive. This next slide is where we are currently, and this is what we've been working with Garver Engineering, their planning division, and then also Matt and Susan on. This is really just a refinement of the same thing, but you'll notice that whereas on this map, a neighborhood's a neighborhood pretty much, and these neighborhood centers are drawn to scale, you know, implying that we're really master planning these. On this map, you can't see it as well, but the neighborhood centers are still there, but we're just identifying the intersection at which those are anchored. And so at that intersection exists a neighborhood center, and it spreads out like a fried egg, where you've got the highest intensity at the intersection and then lower intensity as you're transitioning, or the transect goes towards the lower intensity T3 type land use within the neighborhoods. We've also put a lot more kind of thought into exactly where the regional centers ought to be. If you noticed, a keen eye would have noticed that southwest, that the only regional center in that southern Pleasant Grove regional center was on the southwest undeveloped portion of this. This recognizes that no, it's the entire interchange. And then we are calling these centers out separately. We're also showing higher intensity land use along I-49 than we are in downtown Rogers or at the intersection of Walnut and, well, where the old Dixieland Mall used to be. We're we're also, I think we've put a lot of thought into these corridors and tried to have greater subtlety and fidelity on exactly what we're looking for in the corridors and different types of corridors. Matt mentioned this kind of in passing, but we recognize that there is a need for auto-centric development, that the reality of the economy in the United States is and will be for, a long time probably, that there is a need for auto-centric development, and we're identifying corridors where that makes the most sense. And then we're calibrating the code to support that. At the same time, we're looking at areas that need to be very mixed use, very complete, and even pedestrian primary to achieve the kind of vitality necessary to make placemaking compelling and really support commerce. The creeks are harder to see on this map, on this screen, but they're still there, and we still identify the floodplain and all that. So when we had this, we started with, we had already developed a form-based code for downtown Rogers, and we incorporated basically that same form-based code for the Uptown Pinnacle area. And then we replaced what we called C3, Commercial 3, with a form-based code for the neighborhood centers. And that worked okay. The code itself by this point had been, kind of quilt worked its way together since the 1940s and 50s. And it got to the point where it was a Frankenstein of a code, like so many codes are. And we decided, to really make the most of this transect-based approach to land use planning, we need a development code that's written with this in mind. And so that's where we are today, is replacing our current development code with a unified development code that is at its core managing the transect. And to do that, pretty much everything that you see, on this map behind it would have a set of transect-based zoning districts available, except for the industrial, highway, commercial, the things that don't fit into the transect. And if you think of the transect as this continuum of wilderness to Manhattan, things that are very auto-centric, malls, big single-purpose types of centers, industrial uses, don't fit into that natural continuum. But we recognize that those are also important and have a plan for that. And that's what I had to say. I don't know if I went over, but I will yield my time to the chair. Thank you.
I'm not sure who the chair is, but in
Yeah,
absence of that,
sharing.
in absence of that, I'll jump in. Thank you for that, John. I want to be responsive to some of the questions that folks have popped in here. And I'm going to try to combine maybe a few of them. Can you all, I think it is probably relevant to all three of you. The politics of this has been mentioned several times. Can you highlight, kind of what efforts have been made to get community involvement, maybe to bring the political temperatures down, no matter which side of the aisle or which way you lean. As John said, there's something kind of in this for everyone. But what efforts have been made in Rogers specifically to ensure that politically this is feasible?
I guess that's directed to me. I think that we've had a conversation around this for about the last 6 years, and our message has been very consistent. I think that's important. It's been a learning curve for the public and for the development community. There are some things about Rogers that might make this a little easier than in other areas. Form-based codes are probably, and Matt and Susan may disagree, but I would suspect that form-based codes tend to be very popular in historic downtown areas because they just allow you to continue to infill and develop your downtown the way it historically developed. It can be more difficult in other areas where there's a really high demand for the land around single-use type applications. But in Rogers, there are very few landowners and developers who are working in those types of areas in town. And so we've been joined at the hip with those landowners and developers from day one. Really, fortunately, one thing that kind of helped us out a lot was Hunt Ventures was looking to develop a big chunk of Uptown Rogers and hired a new urbanist type firm to master plan a fairly large development, brought it in as a planned unit development. And it was basically, we looked at it and said, hey, you know what, if we had a form-based code in Uptown Rogers, you wouldn't have, this would be approved by right. I mean, we would, rather than 3 public hearings and a 18-month long public process, just bring it in, we would approve it. And so that, since the market had demanded this type of thing to begin with, we're simply enabling the market to do what the market wants to do and trying to get the staff out of the way. I think it's really important, and something that Matt and Susan have really worked hard on and with our staff, is to figure out ways to make good things allowable by right with administrative approvals, and things that are not so good to require more of a public process. And so we're really trying to streamline our bureaucratic processes. We're trying to only regulate the things that really matter. And we're asking a lot of questions like, do we really care? How much do we care? You know, is it so important that we need to regulate this? Or maybe it's something that it's okay. And not to get, you know, too aggressive about creating rules that don't need to be there. So that's kind of how we've approached this. I think, at least for now, in the city of Rogers, the citizens still have a lot of faith in their local government, that we're not trying to pull anything over on anybody, and that we're working for the common good, for lack of a better term. And so also we operate in a fairly permissive environment.
To follow up on that, Duke, the one thing that John alluded to that has to be handled very delicately are the existing suburban neighborhoods, because those people live there because they want to live there, and they live there because they don't want anything else unlike them nearby. And so as a result, if you noticed on John's comprehensive growth map, that there are areas that are designated, and Matt showed images of this in his presentation. There are ways in which we buffer them with compatible zoning districts. And so one of the biggest, I mean, a single family residence is the single largest investment that the majority of Americans will ever make. And they have a right to be fearful and concerned about the value of their investment. And so one thing that we really work hard on when we do legislative rezonings is to make sure that those areas are protected from intrusion.
I appreciate that. Someone just asked who is remaining anonymous, so they don't want me to know who they are. I'm joking. But it's a question that I had as it pertains to a transect approach and housing affordability. Kind of how is affordability naturally built in? I have some thoughts, but I'd love to hear yours on if that is built into this. It feels to me, a greater yield on the land is a place that affordability could start to appear. But I'd welcome your thoughts. And Matt went off mute, so Matt.
Yeah, I've got some of it, but feel free, Susan and John, to add in. I will add the additional context of the question, which was about areas that have seen form-based codes have seen an increase in their property values, which Susan showed. And there is a big supply and demand element to that, which is that you only have so many of the historic walkable places still in the region. And since the vast majority of new growth had been outward, there's only so many places that you can find that type of environment that has not been supplied to people for a long time. So there's we looked at the numbers recently for Bentonville, and while there's a strong demand for single family homes, there is a very significant unmet demand for apartments. and condos, basically no condos, and there's a demand for condos. They're about equal with their demand for townhomes. Most of them are rentals. So anyways, there's that mismatch between the products that are out there, and that can cause people to end up in a single family home that is above their price point because they didn't have an apartment available. And that takes that home off the market for somebody else who would be who's looking for that home at that price point. So there's a lot of market dynamics in play with the issue of inflating the property values, or property value increase, not so much inflation, but an increase based on the fact that that these places have built more value. It's because there's a draw to them, uh, especially when they're well built. That sort of connection between a beautiful street and the right type of housing. Now, on the other side, you're asking about affordability. And that really gets us into reducing the controls that don't really help with anything. For instance, I had pointed to density and FAR. Like presently, my condo is a 6-unit building, and that's 75 units to the acre. If you tell anybody 75 units to the acre, they'd freak out. But it's a 3-story building, no big deal if you talk about the building form. And so that comes to both providing more housing on less land, which Duke had mentioned, not taking up additional land for parking that you don't need. Each one of those parking spaces is probably now costing about $8,000. It was more before then. So there's elements of cost from land use, and then there's also the size of the unit. When you have certain controls that you find in many use-based codes, like minimum size of a dwelling unit, that works against you from an affordability standpoint, especially as you're seeing the size of apartments across the country reducing. The size of single family homes not necessarily reducing as much, but you've had some really great cottage developments in Northwest Arkansas. And so you're seeing a demand for that, and it's a demand that is unmet. And the more you can allow the market to fill that need, then you're spreading out that you're reducing the size, reducing the cost because square footage is down, less land area to pay for, less parking area to pay for. So it all works together. But that it's a part of that overall market system, where they're just, because the codes have been locked in the system they had for so long, the market's not been able to actually perform in the way that it should.
Yeah, I guess I would say the same thing, but also that, and to grossly oversimplify what a form-based code is, I mean, there's more to it than this, but you can kind of say that the form-based code says that as long as it looks like this, we don't really care what you do with it.
Mm-hmm.
You know? What's inside that structure is of no concern to ours. And so it just creates a whole lot more flexibility and adaptability over time. My wife and I went to Denver to see Thievery Corporation at Red Rocks. It was a great show. And ended up staying in an Airbnb in a very legacy neighborhood in a house. And it wasn't a remarkable house. It was it was a beautiful house, but probably 1930s, 40s, in a neighborhood of similar houses. We stayed in an Airbnb in the basement. There was a family that lived on the ground floor, and there were 2 ADUs on the 3rd floor. From the street, it looked like it was a single family house, you know. But I mean, basically what you're talking, 4 dwelling units on, what do y'all think? Maybe a third of an acre. I mean,
not even.
The density would be very high for that and would be disallowed under, well, the current Rogers code, not the future code necessarily, but just that used to be a single family house, and as Denver has grown bigger and more dense, they've had to do that, and it's actually taken the house to more of a natural, just the way houses do. And by the way, in that neighborhood, most of the intersections had a coffee shop or a laundry or something, for the most part, from an adapted house. And I'll throw this out. I got a briefing at Northwest Arkansas Regional Planning Commission this week or last week talking about the most recent population projections and how soon do we hit 1 million and all this stuff. And the state demographer was in the meeting virtually and explained that she had arrived at the numbers using the cohort method, which is basically looking at the current population, current immigration and immigration rates and death rates and things like that. And it's really just saying, okay, based on the current state, we're projecting the present into the future. And she said, this doesn't take into account anything about the business environment or the possibility of an economic downturn or upturn. Well, I think most of us agree that Northwest Arkansas has always been on the map as a livable place, but it hasn't been on the map as an MPO that is at the level that is attracting major corporations. Walmart has told all of its vendors they must have offices here. And that happened, what, about 7 years ago? And so we have every major CPG in Northwest Arkansas now. They have offices. We have people who are, at the end of their 5-year tour who are being told to go back to, Racine and saying, I don't want to do that. More and more of those people are going to stay here. They're going to start businesses. They're going to become entrepreneurs. We will have more and more startups, more and more businesses, and that will attract more businesses that aren't even CPG firms to come here and open up home offices. I think there's a really good chance, if not a likelihood, that the straight line projections for our population are off on the downside, and that we could be at the beginning of a ramp and we don't have the housing for it. And so, we've got to solve these things, and we're going to do that through intensification or sprawl. I mean, that's basically, those are the two choices. Likely it's going to be a combination of the two, unfortunately. But man, the smart way to do it is to figure out to make the most of the land that we have, and then preserve the beauty around us and the agricultural capability that's also a significant foundation of our economy.
Yeah. It's been said to me, I mean, the market will build the housing that's needed, but now is the time that we decide how and where and what our everyday lives look like when those folks are here and when that housing is built. We have just...
Do we make
Go
it
ahead,
easy?
Matt.
Do we make it easy for them to build it? What I didn't talk about either is the process, and since we have to move on to another question, I did want to note that the more we can streamline processes and make things predictable, that way you can put the decision making in the hands of staff for everything that is predictable, and only elevate the things that are that maybe that really need scrutiny. Then that is a huge help in terms of the cost.
Yeah. And that gets to Luke's question about, small developer trying to get started, the advantages without mortgaging everything into his first project. I think that is one of the natural advantages of this approach, is the predictability. The carry time is going to be a lot less than a process that has to be reviewed by council and reviewed by planning commission over and over and over again. We have just 1 minute left, and selfishly, I have a question as it pertains to our growth. What does the transition look like if we don't have a T6 now, but 400,000 people
Rogers is building a T6, just saying.
Okay, well, we have one in development. What does it look like when there's just time for the zones to shift up? What does that transition look like? If you could highlight that, and then I will briefly close things up, and really appreciate so many of you all sticking around for the full duration. Susan, you're off mute, so do you want to take that?
Well, there's a couple of ways of doing it. One is you build the zone and you don't apply it until such time as you need it. Two is, along with that, Andres Duani, Matt's one of his founding partners at DPZ, has a succession plan built into a lot of codes where every so many years, the municipality picks how many, lands automatically move upward unless there's objection. I think politically that's a challenge, particularly in the T3 areas. Those people don't want to move upward. and so I personally think it's a lot wiser to do it thoughtfully and strategically rather than just everything shifts. But there are a few different ways to do it, and it's usually it would be a legislative rezoning initiated by the council.
And then everything surrounding that would likely shift up too, or there could be some strategic decisions then.
Yeah, there would need to be strategic decisions because like DBZ did a zoning for Sarasota, Florida, where instead of the fried egg, it was the inverse of it because there were these stable historic neighborhoods. And so you had T5 and T4 point whatever on the corridors, and you had T3 in the center because they were all being buffered from the surrounding intensity. So, you have to, different contexts would have different solutions.
That's great.
And that's one thing that in Rogers too, we spend a lot of time looking at corridors, at these roads that used to be smaller roads, and there used to be homes on small roads in a rural environment. It's not like that anymore. And changing the characteristic of those corridors helps to buffer against the neighborhoods behind by types that are better suited for it. And it may be counterintuitive to say buildings closer to those bigger roads are actually better, but that helps to reduce traffic, and it provides a noise break to the community. There's all sorts of benefits for that conversion.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, we've, I think, hit our time, if not gone over slightly. Appreciate everyone joining us today. Before people start dropping off, save May 8th on your calendar right now. We'll get you specific times. That is going to be our spring housing summit. We have a great lineup in the works. Isabel and Lindsay, thank you for putting together a great program today. And all the work you're doing on that housing summit. Matt, Susan, John, thank you so much. This was like, I think, weedsy enough without overdoing it. It's a new, dense, to pull a dad joke in here, subject, but really appreciate the time that you took to prepare and present it today. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks for joining us today, and look for a follow-up email, a recording of this, some of the slides, and thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.
Bye.